Hey, welcome to Book Marketing Mania. I'm your host, Kim Stewart, and my mission is to help you build relationships and reach new readers by guesting on podcasts. In previous episodes, we've talked about how podcast guesting can help you build your author platform and market your books, how to find podcasts to pitch, how to pitch a podcast. So now let's talk about the best moment ever when a podcast host replies and says, "Yes, I'd love to have you as a guest on the show." Imagine that popular meme of two of my fave friends, Rachel and Phoebe, jumping for joy in Roz's apartment, because there's nothing like a podcast host saying yes to your pitch. So once you receive the reply to your pitch and the podcast host invites you to be on their show, then what? How can you surprise and delight your host and listeners by being a great podcast guest? Well, that's what we're talking about today, so let's get to it. As you know, it's such an honor for a podcast host to invite you onto their platform to serve their listeners. It's like being invited to their home and you are the guest of honor. You want to show up well, give them a good experience, and get asked back again, right? So let's talk about what happens before, during, and after the interview to help you be a great podcast guest. So before the interview, you receive an email reply from the podcast host you pitched, and they say, yes, they'd love to have you on the show. Or if you've prioritized building relationships with hosts like we talked about in episode 44, you may receive guest invites without even pitching at all. So the first step in surprising and delighting is respond promptly. Now, if you were a traditionally published author and your publisher has hired a PR agency to pitch for you around your book release date, then they typically take care of all these scheduling details for you. But if you're pitching long before you write a book to build your platform, or if you're a self-published author who doesn't have a PR firm, or if you're a traditionally published author and you're pitching to guest on shows long after your book release, here are some details for you to take note of to make sure you respond promptly. If the host has great guest systems in place, you'll receive a link to their scheduler to pick a time that works and a form to fill out some basic information like your website, bio, social links, information about your book, topics you want to discuss, etc. They may even include a spot for you to share your free resource, which I mentioned in episode 47 about getting your home base ready before pitching. Or they may email you to coordinate and request what they need. If they ask for a copy of your book, send it promptly so they have time to review and prepare for the interview. And if the host doesn't ask for anything, I like to follow up with a quick email, saying I'm looking forward to the interview or the interview with my client, and include their guest resources for easy reference. So I like to put in there the phonetic spelling of your name, if it's not obvious, and your bio. And here, always be strategic. I think you typically have like a static bio. We just copy and paste for everybody, but be strategic and think of the audience that you're serving with this podcast host and how you can customize it to them. And then also you can include a media kit if you have one, either a PDF or a link on your website, your social links, your headshot. You could provide sample questions if those aren't on your website. And again, be strategic here, depending on what your goal is with podcast guesting. Has the topic been covered and you're bringing a unique spin on it? So drive your questions that direction. Or again, drive them to the audience that you're serving. And then also in your media kit, you could include some sticky statements, some quotes, some verses, because again, that might kind of spur questions on in the host mind. And then also include a free resource to share. Now, don't assume that they're going to share it, but just include it as a gift and say, if you would like to share this with your listeners, here's a link to my free gift that goes along with the topic we'll be discussing. So that gives the listeners a chance to go deeper with you. So all those things, again, they might be in the podcast host form to fill out. And if not, I just send them along in an email, just very casually letting them know, here's some resources you might be needing as you prepare for the episode. And I just want to give it to you and have it in your hands with as much advance notice as possible. So I do want to put a little note here. When you're thinking about your free gift, your freebie, your lead magnet, your opt-in, whatever you want to call it, when you're thinking about how you're going to share that during the interview, think of just a short and sweet way you can go about it. And my guest on episode 39 was Sandra Dalton Smith, and she has some great tips on doing this and making it short and simple and easy for the listeners to remember. So be sure and tune into that episode. So next, make sure you add your interview to your calendar so you can be sure to show up where you should be on the day of the interview and you don't block anything else at that time. And again, if systems are in place, you'll receive a calendar invite in your email from the host, but make sure you know if it's audio and video, if it's live video. Will the video be used for repurposing or marketing? I know I like to record on video so I can see the guest and they can see me. But at one time I didn't even do anything with it. So I was always like, come casual. But now I like to use it for promotion. So I like to make sure that we're both camera ready, quote unquote. And then make a note of where you're going to connect. Are you connecting on Zoom? Are you connecting on a different app that they record on? There's so many different ones nowadays. So just make sure you know where you're supposed to be, when, and how you're going to connect with the host. And it's a lot of details to keep up with, I know. So have a system in place where you can keep all this information either on a Google Calendar. If you use Google Calendar, you can put it in your notes section, or just have a Word document going. And if you or your VA have questions about podcast pitching and guesting, I'd love to help you. You can book a discovery call and let's chat about your marketing needs and how I can coach either of you to help build your author platform and market your book through guesting on podcast. So next, to surprise and delight your host, once your interview is booked, keep engaging with the host and nurture that relationship. That makes the recording so much more personal. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was a host and a guest, and they do similar things, but it was just so dry. And I know they probably have known each other for years, but I guess they don't have much of a relationship because I thought the conversation between them was just very dry. You know what I mean? So you probably have noticed that before when you've listened to other podcasts. And so just remember, I've shared before, podcast guesting is never a one and done. There's so many cool things that can come from building relationships with hosts and listeners. And again, you can hear all about that in episode 44. Next, do your homework on the show and the host, which again, if you've been nurturing the relationship, becomes so much easier. So hopefully you've done your homework on the show and who their audience is before pitching them. But if not, be sure to ask the host who they speak to so you can personalize your responses to them. And you don't have to ask in the middle of the interview. Now, who is your audience again? So, do they talk to women? Do they talk to women in certain seasons of lives? Are they talking to moms, wives, parents in general, new believers? And y'all, oh my gosh, it drives me crazy when I listen to some of my favorite Christian podcasts and they just assume, they'll say, you all know this story from the Bible. And I'm like, actually, I don't. So tell me more. And then I feel like, it kind of turns me off. So that's just a heads up and just a little pet peeve of mine. So be sure and ask the host, if you need to, who is the audience you're speaking to and where are they at on their faith journey. So also be thinking of sticky statements from your book and your content and sound bites that will make it easy on the host to promote your episode and for you to repurpose later. Then next, surprise and delight your host by prepping and testing your tech for podcast interviews. You'll want to sound the best you can so you can share it, reshare it again in the future, repurpose it. As you'll always discover, you say all kinds of really great stuff when someone else is asking the questions. So in my mind, best case is you have a USB microphone that plugs into your computer and over-the-ear headphones. And if you're a podcaster, there's no excuse. You should have this equipment already, and you can use it when you're guesting. Then next would be, if you don't have that, you could use headphones that have earbuds built in, headphones or earbuds that have a built-in microphone that plug into your computer. Now, sometimes I have found that those are a little bit echoey when I go to edit my episodes, so just kind of keep that in mind. And then wireless earbuds, we seem to all have those, but they are not typically recommended for a podcast interview. So be sure and look. Sometimes the host will give you specifics of what they expect for you to have for the interview. So make sure you have those. And I will put a link in the show notes for resources on picking microphones and which ones are great for those just starting out, budget friendly. And whatever you pick, be sure and test it out with a friend, and even better if they're a podcast host themselves. Just jump on a quick Zoom call, make sure your settings are appropriate, that Zoom is reading the right microphone and headphones, and then just talk for a few minutes. Make sure you record it so you can watch it later and listen to it and see how it sounds. And if you want to hear more scoop from a guest standpoint, especially about tech nightmares, be sure to tune into episode 26 with my client, author Christine Brown, as she shares 5 lessons learned from her first 5 podcast interviews. Next, let's talk about prepping for the interview the day before. So set a reminder to check in and make sure you have all the details of where to connect and how long the interview will be, that you know how to pronounce the host name, and you know who the listeners are, and you know the topic you'll be talking about. And again, if you have systems in place, you should have all this documented, super easy, and you're just checking it the day before. And then keep in mind that a lot of times hosts will ask at the end of the interview, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners? So think about that ahead of time. Be strategic and think in sound bites again. Is there anything that if it doesn't get covered in your interview that you want to be sure and share with the audience? Make a note of that so it's handy. Now, let's talk about prepping right before your interview. You want to make sure you're in a quiet setting. You've got a good Wi-Fi connection. Make sure your headphones and microphone are all plugged in. Be camera ready if you're going to be on video and it will be shared. Be sure and silence your phone and desktop notifications. I always like to put a sticky note by my computer with the phonetic spelling of the host name because sometimes, oh my gosh, y'all, there's just so many names that you think you know how to say them. And then when it comes out of your mouth, I just cannot get it straight. So I apologize. I know I've done that on plenty of interviews, but make sure you know how to, the phonetic spelling of their name, you know the name of the podcast and who the listeners are. And then before you get started, pray before your interview starts. Sometimes the host will pray when y'all start the interview together, but before you even connect with the host, pray before the interview starts. And I've had to start even asking God to calm my nerves, y'all, because for some reason I get more nervous when it's someone I've already built a relationship with. I don't know what's up with that, but pray also that your conversation will glorify God because that's what we're all about, right? And that you'll be open to the way that He directs the conversation to go. Whether it's something He's speaking into the host or speaking into your heart, just please pray and be open to what He wants you to do. Then next, to surprise and delight your host and listeners, remember to let the host ask the questions and guide the conversation. I need to work on this myself because I get so excited and so passionate and I start talking and then I go off and I forget even what the question is and I have to come back and I'm like, can you remind me what the question was? It's kind of embarrassing. So do your best you can just to make sure that the host can kind of guide that and you don't go off on a tangent that they didn't ask for. And also, I like to think of ways I can drop in mentions of a past episode that has aired on their show or even a guest episode where the host has been a guest on other podcasts because it makes the host look good. Plus, when you listen to them interviewed on other shows, you typically learn little tidbits you didn't know, and they're great connection points you can mention to help build your relationship. And then as your interview wraps up, remember 2 things. A special point you'd like to share that you didn't get around to talking about. Remember, again, they're going to ask, is there anything else you'd like to share? So be quick and think in sound bites. And then 2 is your short and sweet way you're going to invite listeners to connect with you after the interview because they've heard you share for 30 to 40 minutes. They're invested. They love you. They've gotten to know your personality, but they want to stay connected with you. So make sure you have a short and sweet way that they will remember. And as I mentioned above, be sure and listen to the interview with Sandra Dalton Smith, how she talks about this. She is a genius. So now let's talk about after the interview. Whew, the host has hit stop recording, and if this is your first interview, you did it. Yay! You can breathe a sigh of relief. Be sure to thank the host. Again, it's such an honor that they've allowed you time on their platform to reach the listeners that they've worked hard to bring together. So I'm always good at the end of the interview to say thank you, but I'm not always so great at follow-up afterwards, so I've got to be better at this myself. Though I always do try to think of connections I can make afterwards with that podcast host so I can maybe introduce them to another podcaster I know that they'd be a great guest for or vice versa. So finally, after your interview airs, surprise and delight your host by sharing the interview on social and tagging them. You wouldn't believe how many times this doesn't happen. It's the biggest pet peeve of hosts who interview guests. And I have a whole episode on sharing and repurposing your interview coming up, so stay tuned, or better yet, hit the follow button in your podcast player so you don't miss an episode. Y'all, the saying is so true that the host might forget what you said or did, but they won't forget the way you made them and their listeners feel. And remember, podcast guesting and book marketing is all about building relationships and helping people. So show up to serve well as a podcast guest, and you'll be the go-to guest everyone wants to have on their show. So I hope these tips are helpful as you guest on podcasts to build your platform long before and long after your book launch. And if so, I'd be so grateful if you left a review so other writers and authors can discover the show. Thanks for tuning in today, and I'll see you next time to help you market your book one podcast at a time.